Nestled on the outskirts of a quaint rural town, my home was more than just a residence. It was a sanctuary. As a government detective, I spent long hours navigating the complexities of law enforcement, investigating cases that often left me drained. However, once I crossed the threshold of my property, the weight of the world seemed to lift. The expansive fields surrounding my home offered a serenity unparalleled in the city, a stark contrast to the chaos that often accompanied my job. Among the most cherished features of my land stood my barn, a sturdy structure that had been in my family for generations. It was not merely a place to store tools or hay. It was where I felt connected to my roots, a space that brimmed with memories of laughter and hard work. I often retreated there in the evenings, breathing in the scent of fresh hay and listening to the gentle rustle of leaves as dusk settled in. The barn was where I honed my woodworking skills, crafting furniture and projects that reflected both utility and beauty. However, my idyllic life was not without its disruptions. The Homeowners Association had taken a keen interest in my property, frequently citing violations of their obscure rules and regulations. I had learned to navigate their constant scrutiny with grace, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Despite our differences, I still believed in community harmony, until that fateful day when the peace shattered like glass. With the sun setting low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over my land, I noticed something was amiss. A plume of smoke billowed from the direction of my beloved barn, and an icy wave of dread washed over me. Little did I know, this incident would be the catalyst for an investigation far more dangerous than any I had encountered in my career. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, had transformed from a seemingly harmless entity into an incessant thorn in my side. What began as a group of well-meaning neighbors dedicated to maintaining the aesthetic appeal of our community morphed into a power-hungry organization, determined to enforce stringent regulations that often felt absurd and overreaching. Their governing documents, thick and riddled with legal jargon, dictated everything from the color of fences to the types of plants permissible in our gardens. My relationship with the HOA had always been fraught with tension. Despite my attempts to comply, I found myself at odds with their arbitrary interpretations of the rules. A simple modification, like adding wooden shutters to my barn, sparked outrage among board members who deemed it an infringement on community standards. To them, my enhancements were unwelcome deviations from their rigid vision of suburban conformity. There were moments when I would have loved to engage in friendly debates about aesthetics and personal expression, but as time passed, it became increasingly clear that discussions were futile. Each interaction only heightened the existing animosity, and what once felt minor escalated into significant disputes. The HOA imposed fines for infractions I hardly understood, each one further fueling my frustration. Despite my desire for harmony within the community, I felt targeted. My efforts to improve my property only seemed to invite more scrutiny. Reports of alleged violations trickled in, each accompanied by photographs taken from sneaky angles that painted me as some sort of villain daring to challenge their authority. As I reflected on these past conflicts while standing outside my barn after the fire broke out, it was impossible not to connect the dots. This relentless harassment could very well be a prelude to something far more sinister. Little did I know how deeply entwined our fates had become. The day my barn caught fire began like any other, with a crisp morning air that hinted at the arrival of autumn. I had spent the early hours tending to the property, savoring the tranquility that enveloped my home. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I settled into my routine, unaware that this evening would alter everything. I stepped outside to check on my barn, taking in its familiar silhouette against the colorful sky. But as I approached, a thick plume of smoke billowed into view, dark and ominous. My heart raced as I sprinted towards the structure, dread clawing at my insides. Flames danced wildly around my beloved barn, crackling and consuming everything in their path. The warmth of the fire was suffocating. It felt as if my entire world was being reduced to ashes before my eyes. Neighbors began to gather, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Whispers filled the air, speculations about how such a disaster could have happened so suddenly. Some rushed to help, while others stood frozen in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. I could hear snippets of conversation, Words like accident and insurance floated through the chaos, but all I could focus on was the raging inferno devouring my sanctuary. As flames licked higher, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss wash over me, not just for the barn but for everything it represented: family heritage, hard work, and cherished memories. Amid the chaos, I caught sight of a few HOA members lurking at the edge of the crowd, their expressions unreadable yet oddly satisfied. By the time the fire department arrived and began dousing the flames, it was too late. I stood there in shock, grappling with disbelief and confusion. Why did this happen? Who would want to destroy something that meant so much to me? Little did I know that this incident would be more than just an accident. It would mark the beginning of a perilous investigation that would unearth darker truths hidden within our community. As the embers smoldered and the remains of my barn became a charred skeleton, I felt a surge of determination rising within me. My instincts as a detective kicked in, pushing me to sift through the wreckage for any clues that could explain the catastrophic fire. While the community buzzed with whispers of accident, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. In the days following the blaze, I scoured through my belongings, gathering anything that might provide insight. Among the debris, I found fragments of burnt wood and remnants of tools I had worked with for years. However, it was an odd scorch mark on a nearby tree that caught my attention. It seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had used a directed flame to incinerate my barn. Driven by suspicion, I began reaching out to neighbors who had witnessed the fire. A retired firefighter down the street mentioned seeing a dark figure lurking around my property just hours before the flames erupted. The more I probed, the more inconsistencies emerged regarding the timeline of events. It became clear that someone had been watching me closely, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My investigation led me back to the HOA members who had consistently harassed me about my property modifications. When I revisited their past interactions, small details began to connect like pieces of a puzzle. They had always been unreasonably critical, consistently monitoring my every move. Could they have orchestrated this act of arson as a means to exert their control? With this chilling realization, I started compiling evidence, photographs from neighbors, my own notes on HOA meetings, and conversations that took on a new light in hindsight. As I pieced together what felt like an intricate web of deceit, one truth was glaringly evident. They wouldn't stop at intimidation. They had crossed a line into something far more dangerous. It was time to uncover their dark motives and bring them to justice, whatever it took. With a firm resolve to uncover the truth, I launched my investigation under the guise of normalcy. As I navigated the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I masked my growing unease with casual greetings and polite small talk with neighbors. It was essential to maintain appearances while I delved deeper into the unsettling possibility that the HOA had engineered this tragedy. My first step was to gather information from those who may have been privy to the home front dynamics. I began by revisiting conversations with friends and acquaintances, carefully steering discussions toward any unusual behavior they may have noticed among the HOA members. Some of them recounted odd encounters where board members seemed overly interested in my barn and its upkeep, subtly prying for details about my projects. Next, I scheduled a meeting with a few HOA members under the pretense of discussing community initiatives. Sitting around a conference table, I adopted a congenial demeanor, listening intently as they recited their usual rhetoric about neighborhood standards and regulations. Their rehearsed descriptions of community values felt hollow, and I could sense underlying tensions in their smug expressions. I carefully observed body language, searching for even the slightest hint of guilt or knowledge about the fire. Afterward, I discreetly began interviewing neighbors who had witnessed the fire or were familiar with the HOA's dealings. A meticulous note-taker by nature, I jotted down every detail, piecing together timelines and anecdotes. One neighbor recalled overhearing a heated discussion among board members just days before the incident, their voices rising in frustration over my attempts to beautify my property. The deeper I dug, the more I became convinced that there was a collective agenda at play. Yet, every time I uncovered another lead, I was mindful of not alarming anyone. My dual life as a detective and a community member felt increasingly precarious, but the stakes were higher than ever. It was crucial to remain composed as I uncovered this intricate web of deceit, a web that might lead me straight back to the heart of the HOA. As I delved deeper into my investigation, a myriad of potential motives began to emerge, unveiling the complexity of the HOA's actions. It became increasingly apparent that their grievances extended beyond my simple attempts at property improvement. A tapestry of jealousy, financial disputes, and power dynamics wove itself into the fabric of our community's interactions. I recalled how vocal some board members had been about property values and aesthetics. They seemed to view my barn renovations as not just personal affronts, but threats to their vision of the neighborhood. The more I pondered this, the clearer it became that maintaining control over community standards was a matter of pride for them. Perhaps they felt my endeavors challenged their authority and exposed their own insecurities. Moreover, whispers of financial struggles among certain HOA members began to surface in my conversations with neighbors. Some speculated that by intimidating homeowners like me, they could enhance their own property values while keeping dissenters at bay. If I improved my property too dramatically, I could unwittingly illuminate their failings. It was far easier for them to rally against what they perceived as a rogue element than confront issues within their ranks. As I gathered evidence, one particular incident resurfaced in my memory, a heated argument between two HOA members during a meeting I'd attended weeks prior. They were disputing budget allocations for landscaping projects, revealing clear lines of division and rivalry among them. Personal vendettas appeared to be brewing beneath the surface, old grievances that might have reached a boiling point with my barn as the catalyst. I realized that this was about more than mere control. It was also about power and prestige within our community. The fire had not just destroyed wood and nails. It had uncovered hidden animosities simmering in the shadows. The deeper I probed into these motives, the more dangerous my pursuit of justice felt. But with each revelation, I became ever more resolute in seeking the truth behind this web of deceit and betrayal. The day of the confrontation with the HOA leaders finally arrived, and I felt the weight of my resolve pressing heavy on my shoulders. With mounting evidence in hand and a fire lit beneath my determination, I walked into the HOA meeting room, a sense of purpose fueling each step. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and I could feel the clammy grip of apprehension as I took my seat at the table, opposite the board members who had made my life so difficult. As the meeting commenced, I maintained a composed demeanor, listening as they droned on about community initiatives and upcoming projects. Their rehearsed smiles and casual banter felt all too disingenuous as I prepared to instigate what I hoped would be a pivotal dialogue. When it was finally my turn to speak, I could see their expressions morph from polite curiosity to dread. I need to discuss the recent fire that claimed my barn. I began, my voice steady but firm. The air around me shifted. People leaned forward with interest while others shifted uneasily in their seats. I have reason to believe it was not an accident. Gasps rippled through the room as board members exchanged apprehensive glances. I pressed on, detailing everything I'd uncovered. Overheard conversations about property values, suspicious behaviors leading up to the fire, and even personal vendettas within their ranks. It was a bold move, but I needed them to understand that I knew far too much for their comfort. Your actions have consequences, I asserted, catching sight of a few members pale under the weight of my words. This is no longer just about me. It's about accountability within our community. The tension peaked as chairs scraped against floors and defensive postures emerged among them. This wasn't just a cracked facade. It was rather like a dam bursting open under pressure. I could see it in their eyes, fear and anger mingling dangerously as they realized that their hold over me was slipping. With every word, I sensed their confidence waver. My quest for justice had turned into a confrontation filled with unspoken implications lurking in every corner of that room. The truth was out there now, and whether they accepted it or not, there would be no ignoring its presence from here on out. As I dug deeper into my investigation, I began to notice subtle shifts in the dynamics of my neighborhood. The confrontation with the HOA had cast a spotlight on their oppressive tactics, and whispers of discontent started to ripple through the community. It dawned on me that I might not be alone in this fight after all. During my daily routines, I struck up conversations with neighbors who had previously seemed disengaged or indifferent. To my surprise, Many expressed their frustrations with the HOA's overreach and the stifling regulations that had been imposed on us all. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I found myself chatting with a retired couple from down the street. They shared stories of how they had been fined for minor landscaping choices and explained how they too had felt isolated by the HOA's strict enforcement of rules. Emboldened by our shared grievances, I proposed a neighborhood gathering under the ruse of discussing community beautification. As we gathered in my backyard, a sense of camaraderie formed among those present. Each person recounted tales of their own encounters with the HOA's heavy-handedness, from fines for fence colors to absurd restrictions on outdoor decorations. It became clear that there was a collective frustration simmering beneath the surface. When I divulged my findings about the fire and speculated on the HOA's involvement, there was an energetic shift. People leaned forward, eager to lend their support and share what they knew. Some offered to dig through old records, while others volunteered to speak with other neighbors who might have witnessed suspicious activities around the time of the fire. What started as a personal quest for justice was evolving into something greater. It was becoming a movement against an oppressive force that had stifled our community for too long. With unexpected allies rallying behind me, I felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about reclaiming our rights and standing together for accountability against a system that had failed us all. With a newfound sense of purpose and allies on my side, the next phase of my investigation involved meticulously building a case against the HOA. I needed more than just suspicions. I required concrete evidence to bring their alleged crimes to light. I started by conducting informal interviews with neighbors who had attended the barn fire. Many recounted seeing unusual activity in the days leading up to the incident, adding layers to my understanding of the timeline. With their permission, I recorded these conversations, both for accuracy and as potential witness testimonies later. Next, I turned to surveillance options. After scouring through local security footage from nearby homes and businesses, I hoped to capture any suspicious figures near my property. It wasn't long before a grainy video caught my attention, a shadowy figure near my barn just hours before the fire was reported. Though indistinct, it was enough to fuel my determination and confirm that someone had been lurking with intent. Simultaneously, I began combing through digital footprints. I requested access to HOA communications, hoping to find emails or messages that might hint at collusion among board members. As I dug deeper into community forums and social media groups, I discovered heated discussions about my property and unflattering remarks directed at me. This not only highlighted their motives, but also demonstrated that public sentiment was less favorable toward them than they had assumed. Feeling emboldened, I constructed a detailed timeline of events correlating witness statements, video evidence, and digital correspondence. Each piece fitted together like a puzzle revealing a larger narrative of harassment that pointed directly back to the HOA. With every new finding, I felt the balance of power shifting. I was no longer just an isolated victim, but rather a determined detective on the verge of exposing an intricate conspiracy. As the pieces began to align, I prepared for the next step. Confronting the HOA once again with this newfound evidence, ready for a showdown that would demand accountability for their actions. The momentum was palpable, and with it came the hope of justice, not just for myself, but for all those who had suffered under their reign. The night of the community meeting loomed like a charged storm cloud, and I felt a mixture of anxiety and adrenaline coursing through me as I prepared to confront the HOA publicly. Allies gathered at my home beforehand, their faces a blend of determination and apprehension. Together, we carefully reviewed our evidence, witness statements, surveillance footage, and incriminating digital communications. This was the moment we had all been waiting for, a chance to hold the HOA accountable. When we arrived at the community center, the atmosphere buzzed with an electric tension. Residents filled the room, their whispers a cacophony that hinted at the growing dissatisfaction with the HOA. I could see familiar faces among the crowd. Neighbors who had once seemed powerless now stood resolute, ready to stand against the oppressive board. As I took my place at the front, the HOA leaders sat defiantly at their table, their expressions a mix of disdain and concern. I began my presentation calmly, outlining how the fire had not only destroyed my barn, but had exposed deeper issues of corruption and control within our community. The room fell silent as I detailed each piece of evidence, the weight of my words settling heavily over the crowd. When I revealed the surveillance footage showing a figure lurking near my property just hours before the fire, gasps echoed throughout the room. The tension mounted as I pointed out how the HOA had benefited from fostering fear and intimidation among residents, using their strict regulations as a tool to maintain control. The atmosphere shifted as I called for collective action against their tactics. Suddenly, voices began to rise in solidarity from the crowd, echoing my sentiments. Neighbors recounted their own experiences of harassment and fines imposed by the HOA. The board members squirmed under the mounting pressure, their facade crumbling as dissent erupted around them. In that defining moment, it became clear that we were no longer isolated. We were united in our fight for justice. The show of support emboldened me further, transforming my personal quest into a community-wide movement. With resolve ignited in our hearts, we were ready to reclaim our neighborhood from those who had sought to divide us. This was our moment of truth, a turning point that would shape our future together. In the aftermath of the community meeting, the atmosphere within our neighborhood underwent a profound transformation. The confrontation had sparked something greater than I had anticipated. It ignited a collective desire for change and justice that spread like wildfire. Residents who had once felt intimidated by the HOA began to share their stories more openly, emboldened by our united stand. Conversations flourished in driveways and over backyard fences, as neighbors formed small groups dedicated to exploring legal actions against the HOA. It wasn't long before petitions were circulated demanding an investigation into their practices. Some residents sought legal counsel regarding their own grievances, claiming harassment and unjust fines. Local attorneys showed interest in representing our cause pro bono, recognizing the potential for a class action lawsuit. Hope flickered brightly in our hearts. This wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about accountability for the entire community. As I gathered with my neighbors for planning sessions, a palpable sense of empowerment permeated the air. We discussed contact information for attorneys, shared documentation of complaints against the HOA, and outlined strategies to challenge their authority. The dynamic among us shifted. Where fear had once reigned supreme, solidarity stood tall. The board members found themselves on the defensive, as community meetings became platforms for accountability rather than mere formalities they controlled. They realized the momentum had shifted against them, and threats of retaliation were no longer effective deterrents. It was a refreshing reversal. Suddenly, it was they who needed to justify their actions, not us. Finally, as whispers of potential legal consequences loomed overhead, I felt vindicated. The journey from a lone investigator seeking justice to a catalyst for community-wide reform was staggering. In reclaiming our strength, we reclaimed hope, one that promised a brighter future for every homeowner suppressed under the HOA's heavy hand. Driven by that newfound spirit, we prepared to advance our collective pursuit of justice and set forth toward a new chapter in our community's history, one defined by cooperation, transparency, and mutual respect rather than fear and control. As I stood on the remnants of my once beloved barn, now reduced to ashes, I reflected on the journey that had unfolded since that fateful night. The fire had not only sparked a devastating loss, but had also ignited a fire within our community, a determination to seek justice and reclaim our voices. Through the trials and tribulations, I had learned the delicate balance between personal peace and civic responsibility. Justice, I realized, is not merely about punitive measures or retribution. It is about the restoration of trust and the reinforcement of community bonds. In standing up against the HOA, I had found purpose beyond my own grievances. I was advocating for every neighbor who felt powerless under the weight of oppression. Each voice that joined ours reaffirmed the importance of unity in the face of adversity, an essential lesson for any community striving for harmony. Yet, as much as we celebrated our progress, I understood that challenges lay ahead. The confrontation with the HOA was not an endpoint, but rather a beginning. With legal proceedings possibly on the horizon, we needed to prepare for resistance from those who thrived on control and fear. The stakes were high, and maintaining our momentum would require vigilance and sustained effort from all involved. Looking toward the future, I felt a mix of optimism and caution. While we had reclaimed our power and established accountability, I knew that complacency could reverse our hard-won victories. Our journey highlighted the necessity for ongoing dialogue, transparency, and active participation in community governance, a vigilant stance against complacency. As we moved forward, my heart swelled with hope for a neighborhood defined not by fear, but by collaboration. Together, we could cultivate a new culture, one rooted in respect, shared values, and mutual support. This was not just about righting past wrongs. It was about building a legacy of resilience for generations to come. With renewed resolve, I embraced the path ahead, ready to navigate whatever challenges awaited us in our quest for true community justice.